I'm doing a quick review for this book. It's called The Two Cities by Malcolm Barber. So this book, it's like a medieval history book of Europe. It's between the years 1050 and 1320. I was really excited to read this book because this is a real hole in my history knowledge. And I know little bits about medieval history, but really not very much at all. So I was quite excited to read this book, although it has been a bit of a disappointment. So this book is just really boring. It was just the way that it was written. So I think that it is a really interesting subject. It's trying to cover sort of whole of Western Europe, which is a big ask, and I think it was just a bit too big an ask. Because it ended up just sort of running through lists of dates and times and places and names, and unless you know them all already, you're just not gonna keep up with that, and it's just really boring as well. So I was a bit disappointed in the book, but there was a lot that was interesting in there. I was like, that does actually sound really interesting. We're just only staying on it for 3 seconds. So I think I'm definitely still interested in learning more about medieval history in, well, actually anywhere, but this is in sort of Europe. But it does still sound really interesting. This is just not the book for me to learn about it. But if people can give me a recommendation, I'm definitely happy to look into that. So I've got a few notes about the book to run through. Really boring. I think that's an important point. So it's an interesting subject, but this book, it was over 500 pages and it was just dry and boring the whole time. I've read some really good history books before where they really give you a sort of mood of the time, and you can really feel, it's not a story obviously, but you feel like you're there. You didn't get that with this. It was just lists of names, dates, places, and really very little sort of context and character of the people. I didn't like the layout of the book, so he goes through different sort of regions and areas. So he goes through this sort of social and economic structure, which was actually one of the more interesting parts, because although I am interested in kings and queens and royalty, I'm really most excited by hearing about everyday people and everyday life, because then I feel that you can relate more to that. And also the rich people were generally a bit like arseholian. So he talks about the church, who were obviously really powerful at that time, and really important to understand their role in the whole of society. And then he starts going through regions. So you've got the empire, which is sort of Germanic. You've got like Sicily, Italian states, and then you've got like the French, English sort of areas, the Crusader states, and then lastly he sort of talks about the medieval worldview, intellectual life, art and society. So yeah, the social part I sort of found interesting. He was sort of talking about the sort of move from the feudal system and moving into building towns, which I didn't realise weren't really like free areas for people, like, because you just didn't have the freedom of movement, and like the trade guilds and things. That was very interesting, which could be very controlling. I've got to be honest, this whole period of history sounds horrible. It sounds really controlling, and just somewhere I would not want to live, whichever sort of bit of the hierarchy you're at. It sounds very controlled, and it doesn't sound very fun. It just sounds quite miserable. He talks about that this was a period of growth in the Western history. So you had a big growth in population, and you had a lot of economic growth, and that this, obviously creates a lot of changes in the way that people are living. That was sort of, although it was written in a boring way, it's obviously very interesting. He's talking about the church. I'm always interested in sort of the mental gymnastics that church can do in the way that they justify Crusades and things like that. Because obviously it's supposed to be based on the teachings of Jesus Christ and everything. But they managed to bend it in just incredible directions. Right, so what else? I felt that, so one of the reasons I also felt that this book didn't work, because it was going from area to area and then just lightning running through this list of names and places that you have no background on, you just don't know what it's talking about. And then you'll go to another region, you think, oh, that was definitely a name that I heard before. I mean, there's so many names being thrown at you, but you didn't know who that person was when it was talking about that region because you hadn't read this region yet. Or it will just say, oh, and then so-and-so met so-and-so, so that was the end of their reign. And you think, well, why? And it isn't till you go and read that region that you realise, oh, there was all this tumultuous stuff and they were connected. So just no context. I think the only person this book would work for is if you already know the histories of each region quite well enough, and then you're reading this book to see how they all link and tie together, because they did link and tie together a lot. It would be useful for that, but you'd have to know that already. And it would still be really boring to read the same 300 years repeated, 12 times or whatever. I would, as much as it's harder to get that whole context and pull all those different bits together and go gradually through the time, I think it's a much more interesting, a nicer read. One of the things I thought was really interesting was he talks about population growth, and there was this chart in here which just blew my mind. I don't know how well you can see this, but it's showing the population growth, and it's going back to 400 BC, AD, 400 BC. Then to 0, 400. So it's showing that it was kind of, not a lot was going on. It was kind of static. And then it just goes insane from about 1600. And because I keep having this thing where I just feel like there's so many bloody people everywhere. And it's not that I don't like people, but I think I'm more aware of people's energy now, which is all very hooey, but I just don't it's just I can feel all this energy of all these people, and it's like everywhere you go there's just so many people. So it's really interesting looking at that chart and the change in population growth, because I was just thinking, and the fact that it stayed static sort of for a lot of years as well, and I was just trying to imagine how much different Europe would be. It would be so different, and you would be so much more isolated, and so much, there was less travel. Obviously roads were different and things like that. It would just be such a different headspace. So that was interesting to think about. What else? It sounded like a very restricted society, which I don't like the sound of. The feudal system, it's obviously very controlling. The guild system sounded very controlling. There was laws controlling movement and what occupation and freedom people could have in that occupation. And their property and things like that. Obviously, as a woman, let's not even get into that. Another thing that was interesting to learn a bit more about was usury and the Jewish community. So this is another kind of mental gymnastics thing through the Christian church. So Jesus Christ has said no usury, right? Which is like lending money for profit, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong. But then you had the Jewish community, and it was, from what I was saying in this book, it was almost like a protected part of the community, because the noble people and whoever could afford to wanted to use them for borrowing money. So they made them a protected group of people, but they also put laws in place to make sure that they couldn't integrate to a certain degree into the community. So this is just causing massive social disruption, because you've got this group of people who aren't integrating, and they're also protected, and it's obviously just going to cause friction, and it's just done so that these people can borrow money off of them. And then you have the development of the Northern Italian banking system, which is again usury, but it's kind of protected and loopholed and everything, because again it's royalty and nobility who are using them, who want that access, so it becomes allowed. And and I was thinking about, if you look at later on in history, where you have sort of the expansion of the British Empire, which was very much backed by the money lending of the Bank of England, and the more and more weak base of the economy. Now you do get a lot of growth in society from lending and debt, but Jesus, it causes a lot of problems. It's a real sort of tricky area, and it is interesting to learn about. And also the papacy and how much power they had, and power in societies, and also their interest in borrowing money for things that they want to do, projects they want to do, and how they still want to keep this kind of papal empire. It was really interesting to read about their power struggles with the different monarchies and the monarchy systems. And you see these monarchies, they're obviously all fighting amongst themselves for power. They all have to have allegiance to the papacy to a certain extent, or, there'll be some sort of uprising against them. It's very interesting, this sort of power play. So there was a lot of interesting themes in there. It was just written in such a boring way. Right, I've got one quote. Let's see, page. It's a massive book as well. It was really, really long. So, I mean, I can get through boring bits if it's just a little bit, you've got to sometimes have a boring list of information. But it was just too much of it. Right. So this quote is about the Crusades. The Crusades grew out of the papal reform movement, for they provided the papacy with a means to put its ideas about the regeneration and purification of society into practice. The formation of an army of God had a double advantage in that it provided a means of enforcing papal will, and at the same time diverted the warlike activities of the most belligerent classes of society towards papal ends, instead of their preoccupation with internal feuding and attacks upon the clergy or clerical property. In its most dramatic form, this entailed the recruitment of large armies to fight an external enemy which, it was claimed, had violently seized the holy places, the very sites of Christ's life, death and resurrection, persecuted the Christian inhabitants, and erected idols in place of the worship of the true faith. However, the concept was more flexible than this. Gregory VII had already used papal armies against the enemies of the faith in Italy, and had presented them as soldiers of Christ. And although in the 12th and 13th centuries the capture and defence of Jerusalem remained central to the Christian vision of the Crusade, the instrument which the papacy had forged could be used in other contexts, apparently with equal validity. Indeed, the original idea of a Christian just war, formulated by St. Augustine in the pre-Islamic era, necessarily conceived that such force would be used against those who would disrupt Christian society, such as heretics, schismatics, or men of violence. So it's really interesting to learn about the Crusades and how they sort of sprung up. And there's a lot of talk in there as well about the church reforms and things like that, because you often had sort of local important powerful families who would try and get their people into the church and things. So a lot of the church reforms were to try and counter that. So it is really, really interesting, and I'd be interested to read a more interesting book. It also spoke about the life of the monks and their sort of searching for reclusivity, or like a simpler way of life and things like that, but how that also easily became an easier way of life, and they made a lot of money and things. Also talked about, it didn't talk a lot about women, but it spoke a little bit about women in the church, and they really sort of seemed to be looked down upon, like the church didn't even seem to really want to include them at all, but they sort of did, begrudgingly, because so many women were interested to be sort of religious and close to God and things. It's all very it's very interesting to see these ideas and ideals, you know, coming into actual human interactions and behaviours and setups in societies. Right, so I think that's about it. I wouldn't recommend the book because it was so incredibly boring. But I'm definitely interested to learn more about this area. And if you do already know all the sort of medieval history of different European regions of that time, then it's probably an alright book. You can probably put up with the just lists of things because you know the context that they relate to. Right, so onto the book that I'm reading now. I'm reading this book, The Road to Gomorrah, which is sort of about it's about the Second World War, and I'm nearly halfway through that. That's going very well. I'm literally flying through that book. And then I've got a whole bunch of books that I want to read next. I'm sort of on to my next load of books. So I'm just going to talk really briefly about them. And if anybody has read them or can say, yeah, that's definitely a good one, read that, I would really be interested because I can never decide which book to read next. So I've got The With's Way by Paul Kudenek. I read one of his books before, The Anarchist Revelation. I've got Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. This is my hard traditional book. I've got Star Signs by Linda Goodman. I'm quite into astrology at the moment. I mean, I've always sort of liked astrology, but I don't know a lot of the real detail of it, I'll be honest. But I've been watching a few videos about current astral and galactic movements, and it sounds like there's a lot going on at the moment, so I'm sort of interested again to sort of learn a bit more about it. I've got Utopia Avenue by David Mitchell. So I read a David Mitchell book before, Cloud Atlas, which was an incredibly good book, incredibly well written. I don't read a lot of fiction, so this is one of my sort of fictions, one of them. I've got The Nature of the Psyche, which is a Seth book by Jane Roberts and Robert F. Butts. If you know me at all, you know I love the Seth books, so this is like the next one to read. And I've got this, None Dare Call It Conspiracy, by Gary Allen, which I've heard a few people talk about. And I hate the word conspiracy because of all the attachments to it and just the ridiculous attachments to it. But obviously I am really interested in all the alternative narratives going on, because there is so much going on at the moment and it is interesting. So I've got that book to read as well. So let me know if you've got an opinion on any of them and what you think. And other than that, I'll be back next month. I think I will definitely have read The Road to Gomorrah because I'm halfway through that already. But I don't know what else I'm going to read next after that. So let me know what you think. Okay, thank you.